Okay, so picture this with me. It's 1978. Cold War, tensions are running high, and you've got this high-ranking Russian Orthodox metropolitan dies in the Vatican. Not exactly an everyday occurrence, right? And that unexpected event is going to be our deep dive today as we explore the life of Metropolitan Nikodim Rotov.
Wow, it's amazing how these pivotal events can unlock deeper understanding, about the forces at play during a certain era, the political tension, the theological debates, that human desire for unity in this backdrop.
Yeah, absolutely. And the source we're looking at for this deep dive is this article, and get this, it's titled On Heresiarch Nikodim Rotov. So talk about a bold statement right off the bat, don't you think?
It definitely grabs your attention, that's for sure. Using a term like heresiarch carries a lot of weight, immediately establishing Nikodim as a central figure in what they perceive as this theological deviation.
Yeah, and it really sets the stage for a very specific perspective, for sure. So for those who don't know, Nikodim was a prominent figure in the Russian Orthodox Church. Ordained as a bishop in 1960, and get this, he was the youngest in the world at that time. Rose through the ranks, became a key figure in the Moscow Patriarchate, and he was particularly known for his dedication to ecumenism, so actively working to bring greater unity between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic churches.
And it's fascinating, his journey, especially given the historical context. We're talking about the Soviet era here. The lines between the church and the state, they were blurry, to say the least. Suspicions were rampant, with many high-ranking clergy rumored to be informants for the KGB.
And this article definitely doesn't shy away from alleging that Nikodim was one of them. They even go as far as to say that he had a code name, Sviatoslav, suggesting some kind of clandestine involvement with the regime.
That's quite the accusation. It really highlights why it's so important to understand those intricacies of the Soviet Union's relationship with the church, to fully grasp the weight of that. Imagine the weight of leading a religious institution under the ever-watchful eye of a government that frankly was hostile to your faith.
It really just adds a whole other layer of complexity to his story. And then on top of that, you have his death, right? This article doesn't see it as just a coincidence, but rather this divine intervention, a punishment, they say, for his pursuit of, bringing these different denominations together.
Now, that's a very fascinating interpretation. To view his death, and it's interesting that it happened in the Vatican of all places, to view that as some sort of direct message against these ecumenical efforts. Well, it adds a layer of intrigue, I'd say, theological intrigue for sure.
It's like something straight out of, I don't know, a Dan Brown novel, right?
Right.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's rewind for a second. To really grasp the weight of these accusations, we have to delve into this concept of surgeonism. It's a term the article throws around quite a bit, and it's really central to their whole argument against Nikodim.
Oh, absolutely, surgeonism. So it's this complex theological position that emerges within the Russian Orthodox Church. And it's specifically during the Soviet era.
Yeah.
Right? And to simplify it, I guess you could say it advocated for complete and total loyalty to the Soviet state, even if it meant compromising on some religious principles.
So it's almost like this internal struggle within the church. Do you comply with the state, even if it could compromise some of your beliefs? Or do you resist and then risk persecution?
Exactly, yeah. And that very internal conflict, it's key to understanding the complexity of Nikodim's actions, right? Was he truly, as the article claims, a KGB operative working against the church's interest? Or was he perhaps more of a pragmatist, somebody trying to maneuver within a very restrictive system to ensure the church's survival?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to unpack that even further, we need to look at Nikodim's involvement with Vatican II. And, this was a landmark event for the Catholic Church. So for those unfamiliar, think of Vatican II as this major reset button for the church. It happens in the 1960s, this period of immense social and political change, and the goal was basically to modernize the church's approach to the world, and in that, its relationship with other Christian denominations.
And that is where Nikodim's, this commitment that he had to ecumenism, that's where it comes into play. He was super involved in the lead up to Vatican II, and the article suggests that he played a significant role in shaping the council's stance on communism.
Which, according to this article, was to kind of downplay any criticism of the Soviet regime, right? They claim that he was doing the bidding of the KGB, essentially striking this deal to shield communism from being condemned.
Right, and that's really the core of their argument, isn't it? They point to this alleged, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, as evidence of his betrayal. They're suggesting that he put the interests of this, totalitarian regime above his religious duties.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty damning accusation when you put it that way. But to be fair, I think we need to at least acknowledge that not everyone sees it the same way, right? Not everyone views Nicodem's actions through that lens.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, we have to remember that history is hardly black and white,
Yeah.
right? There are always multiple perspectives at play, different ways to interpret the same set of events. And when it comes to Nicodim, well, there are those who argue that his actions, well, maybe a little unorthodox, pun not intended, were ultimately about the survival of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Yeah, they see him as, well, a pragmatist, this skilled diplomat operating within a system that didn't really give him much wiggle room, right? Imagine, you're leading a church in a country where atheism is the official doctrine. Any perceived dissent, well, that could be met with some pretty swift and brutal repression.
It's a chilling thought, really, when you think about it. It puts his actions in a whole different light. I mean, were his attempts to kind of minimize conflict, to not rock the boat too much with the Soviets, was that a sign of cowardice? Or was it a calculated strategy to simply stay alive, to keep the church going?
It's the question that's really at the heart of this whole debate, isn't it? Was he a traitor to his faith or a really, really shrewd operator playing a dangerous game to protect the church?
And that's where this whole idea of surgeonism that we were talking about, that becomes so crucial, don't you think? Because it provides this framework for understanding how some within the church rationalize this collaboration.
Exactly, yeah. Surgeonism, and we talked about this a little earlier, but it emerges in response to this immense pressure that the church is facing under Soviet rule, right? And essentially, their argument is this. Complete loyalty to the state, even if it means compromising certain principles, that's the only way to ensure the church's survival.
A pragmatic approach, for sure. And while it's impossible to say with certainty if Nicodim was like a card-carrying member of the Surgeonism Club, it's highly likely that he was influenced by it, given everything going on around him at the time.
So the article condemns his actions as heretical, but others might say that, well, he was just working within this really complex web of political and theological realities that forced him into making some really, really difficult choices.
Absolutely. And that is what makes Nicodim such a fascinating figure to study, right? He just defies these easy categorizations. A man of deep faith who also, understood the art of political maneuvering. A bridge builder who's also facing these accusations of betrayal.
He was a product of his time. There's no doubt about that, shaped by the events that really defined the 20th century. But let's bring it back to his death for a second. We talked about how the circumstances surrounding his passing, especially the war that it happened in the Vatican, well, that's a pretty central piece of the article's narrative.
For sure. The author doesn't see it as just a coincidence. It's this very symbolic event for them, a divine judgment against Nicodim for all of these perceived transgressions.
They even go as far as comparing him to Judas, the disciple who betrayed Jesus. It's a pretty powerful image to invoke, right? One that underscores the severity of those accusations. But is it warranted? Or is it a sign of, I don't know, maybe a deeper bias within the article itself?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's definitely provocative comparison, evokes a sense of betrayal, and not just any betrayal, but betrayal on this grand scale. It's painting Nicodim as someone who betrayed not just the church, but, God himself.
So we have Nikodim, this really ambitious figure in the Russian Orthodox Church, right? And he's trying to navigate like the really treacherous waters of the Cold War while also trying to bridge this huge divide between these two really powerful branches of Christianity. It's a story full of contradictions, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And it's during this time with Vatican II is this backdrop that these contradictions, they become even more pronounced. You mentioned earlier that Vatican II was like this reset for the Catholic Church. Could you unpack that a bit more for our listeners? What were some of the big things that led up to this monumental event?
So imagine you have this church, right, steeped in centuries of tradition, and then they suddenly realize we need to adapt to this rapidly changing world. That was Vatican II. The world was changing, socially, politically, technologically, you name it. And the Catholic Church, to their credit, they recognized that they needed to reevaluate their place in all of it.
It was a time of some really intense reflection and reform. And one of the areas they focused on most was, as you said, ecumenism. This idea that they needed to try and build unity and encourage dialogue between these different Christian denominations. For centuries, they had often viewed each other with, suspicion at best, even hostility. But Vatican II, this signaled a real desire for reconciliation, for understanding.
And that's where Nicodim comes into the picture, right?
Yeah.
This guy's so committed to bridging the gap between these two churches, the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. He saw Vatican II as this opportunity, like a real chance to start to mend these centuries-old divisions. But if you go by the article, his motives, they weren't totally pure. They paint him as more of a cunning, I don't know, operator working in the shadows to push the Soviet agenda forward.
The article claims that he used his position to influence how Vatican II turned out, especially when it came to the Church's stance on communism. And remember, this is the Cold War at its peak. The Soviet Union was not messing around. They wanted to shut down any criticism of their ideology, especially on a global stage.
So what they're saying is that Nikodim, on behalf of the KGB, made a deal with the Vatican, Orthodox representation at Vatican II, and in return, they had to keep quiet on the whole communism issue.
That's the whole crux of their argument.
Yeah.
That's their smoking gun, so to speak. They say this alleged quid pro quo, well, this is proof of his betrayal. It's suggesting that he put the interests of this totalitarian regime above his duties to his faith.
Which is, yeah, a pretty hefty accusation. To be fair, though, I think we have to acknowledge that not everybody sees it that way.
You're absolutely right. It's so important to remember that history is rarely black and white. There are always multiple perspectives, right? Different ways of looking at the same thing. And with Nikodim, you have a lot of people who argue that, okay, maybe what he did wasn't exactly by the book, but ultimately he was trying to ensure this survival of the Russian Orthodox Church.
They see him as, I don't know, as a pragmatist, maybe? A really skilled diplomat working within a system that didn't really give him a lot of options. I mean, put yourself in his shoes for a second. You're leading a church in a country that's declared itself officially atheist. Any little thing that seems like dissent, they could come down on you hard.
Yeah, it's a scary thought when you really let that sink in. It definitely makes you think about his actions differently. So were his attempts to just like minimize conflict, to, not poke the bear, so to speak, with the Soviets, was that a sign of cowardice? Or was it a calculated move to like literally stay alive, to keep the church going?
It's a question that keeps coming up, doesn't it? Was he a traitor to his faith or a really, really smart guy just playing a really, really dangerous game to protect the church?
And this is where understanding surgeonism comes in, I think. It gives you this framework for how some people within the Russian Orthodox Church were able to rationalize working with the Soviet regime.
Right. Surgeonism, and we talked about this a bit before, but it comes about in response to all this intense pressure the church is under, living under Soviet rule. And their whole argument, it boils down to this: complete and total loyalty to the state, even if you have to compromise on some of your religious principles. Why?
Yeah.
Because it's the only way to make sure the church survives.
It's a very pragmatic approach.
Yeah.
And it's impossible to say for sure whether Nikodim was like a surgeonist with a capital S, but he had to be influenced by it, just given everything happening around it.
So the article, it condemns what he did as heresy, right? But other people would say, no, he was operating within these really complex realities, both political and theological. He had to make really, really tough calls, maybe even uncomfortable ones.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes Nikodim such a fascinating figure. It doesn't fit neatly into any box, which is what makes it so interesting to study. He was this deeply faithful man, but he also knew how to maneuver the political landscape. He wanted to build bridges between people, yet he's being accused of this really deep betrayal.
He was a product of his time, there's no doubt about that,
Yeah.
shaped by everything going on in the 20th century. But let's go back to his death for a minute. We were talking about the circumstances surrounding how he died, and specifically where it happened at the Vatican. And it's a key part of this article's narrative.
Oh yeah, the author doesn't think it's a coincidence at all. For them, it's the symbolic event. Like Nikodim is being judged by a higher power for what they see as his sins.
They even compare him to Judas, the disciple who betrayed Jesus. That's a bold statement to make, don't you think? Really emphasizes how serious these accusations are. But is it really a fair comparison to make? Or does it tell us more about the biases of the article than it does about Nikodim?
Right, that's something to think about for sure. Comparing anybody to Judas, it's provocative to say the least.
Gotcha.
It brings up this idea of betrayal on a massive scale. It's saying that Nikodim betrayed, not just the church, but God.
Yeah, comparing someone to Judas, that's about as serious as it gets. And it does kind of feel like something out of a play, right? This idea that he's struck down right there in the Vatican by divine judgment. But couldn't you also see his death in a totally different way?
Of course. I mean, the article we've been talking about, they frame it as divine retribution, yeah. Well, we got to remember, that's just one interpretation, right? It's not exactly a historical fact. If we only look at it through a theological lens, we miss all those other complexities of his life, the times he was living in.
Let's be real for a second. People die. Sometimes it's dramatic. Sometimes it's, well, not. But to say that there's this, like, spiritual reason for something like death, that seems like a stretch, no.
It definitely makes you wonder about what the author is trying to do here. When you present one single interpretation, especially one as, well, as emotionally loaded as divine judgment, it's easy to oversimplify things. Nikodim becomes this caricature instead of a real person.
And that's what we're trying to avoid, right? We can't just paint these historical figures with these super broad strokes. To say someone's all good or all bad, well, it ignores all those gray areas. And those gray areas, that's where things get interesting.
You got that right. Nikodim, yeah, there's controversy, but we have to understand him. He lived during a time of huge ideological clashes, political maneuvering, and the pressure on religious institutions back then, it was immense. To write him off as, I don't know, just a pawn of the KGB or a
Mhm.
heretic who got what was coming to him, well, it just doesn't do him justice.
It reminds you that history, it isn't always about good guys and bad guys, right? It's about people making impossible choices, dealing with powerful systems, and trying to stay true to what they believe in.
And let's not forget, even those we might disagree with, even those whose actions seem, I don't know, questionable or even, yeah, even wrong, they might have been doing what they thought was right. Maybe they were trying to protect something or preserve something,
Yeah.
just trying to find a way forward when it felt like there weren't any good options.
It makes you think, what would I have done if I was in his shoes? How do you lead a church? How do you stay strong in your faith when you're constantly worried about being punished?
Big questions, and they're still relevant even though the Cold War is over. How do we balance religious freedom with the power of the state? How do we deal with ideological differences? These are issues we're still grappling with.
And that's what I love about history. It's like holding up a mirror. It's not just about the past, it's about us too. It challenges how we think, makes us face hard truths, and in the end, helps us understand the world a little bit better.
Nicodem's story, yeah, it ends tragically, but it teaches us so much about faith, power, and how much people want to be connected, even when everything seems divided. It's a good reminder that we've always got more to learn, more to dig up, more to discuss if we really want to understand the past.
So where does this leave us, honestly? More questions than answers, I think. Was Nicodim a bad guy? Or did things just happen that way? Was he really clever and calculating? Or was he just stuck between a rock and a hard place? I think it was probably a little of both, and that's how it usually goes, right?
Yeah. What's important is that when we look at someone like Nicodem, we have to be both curious and, well, a little skeptical. We can't forget that history isn't this simple story. We need to be open to different points of view, challenge what we think, and not force simple answers onto complicated people.
And maybe, just maybe, if we can wrap our heads around how complicated it all is, if we stop judging the past based on how we see things now, maybe we can, I don't know, learn to be a little more understanding, a little more empathetic, and appreciate how hard it was for the people who came before us.
It's a journey, right? And to really learn from history, we have to be open to it. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being part of a conversation, one that's still going on. And that conversation, it changes how we see the world, how we see our place in it.
Kind of said it better myself, and I think that's a good place to wrap up this deep dive. Nikodim Rotov's story reminds us that history is so much more than dates and names in a dusty book. It's full of life, full of different points of view. It challenges us, it teaches us. So, until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the past.